June 1974. Richard Feynman stands at a podium facing Caltech's graduating class in their caps and gowns. These students have just completed degrees from one of America's most prestigious science institutions. They're expecting the usual commencement speech about reaching for the stars and changing the world. Instead, Feynman tells them that most of what passes for science, including research published in respected journals, taught in university courses, and funded by major institutions, is fundamentally worthless. He calls it cargo cult science, and then he explains why even they, despite years of rigorous training, are probably guilty of practicing it. This comes from Feynman's documented 1974 commencement address at the California Institute of Technology, later published as Cargo Cult Science, and preserved in the Caltech archives. The speech would become one of his most cited warnings about the corruption of scientific thinking. But the story starts much earlier, in the South Pacific during World War II. During the war, Allied forces built airstrips on remote islands across the Pacific. Cargo planes would land, bringing supplies, medicine, food, technology. The indigenous islanders watched these metal birds descend from the sky and unload treasures beyond imagination. They saw the patterns. Soldiers would sit in towers with headphones, speaking into devices. Men with paddles would wave their arms in specific sequences. Runways had to be cleared of debris, and then, reliably, the planes would come. After the war ended, the planes stopped coming. The soldiers left, the supplies disappeared. So the islanders, using pure logic, decided to bring the planes back. They cleared strips of land to create runways. They built control towers from bamboo. They carved headphones from wood and wore them while sitting in the towers. They fashioned antenna shapes from straw. Men stood on the runway waving palm fronds in the same patterns they'd seen the soldiers use. Every element was replicated with stunning attention to detail. The form was perfect. The planes never came. They had everything that looked like an airstrip, everything that appeared to be the conditions for cargo planes to land. But they were missing something fundamental, something invisible. They didn't understand radio waves or flight mechanics or military supply chains. They had copied the form without understanding the substance. To an outside observer, it looked exactly like an airport. To the planes that never came, it was meaningless. Feynman stood at that podium and told those graduating students they were doing the same thing. He wasn't talking about obvious pseudoscience or fringe conspiracy theories. He was talking about published research in academic journals, studies conducted by credentialed scientists at legitimate institutions, work that followed all the apparent rules of scientific methodology, papers that got cited in textbooks, and yet, Feynman argued, most of it shared the same fundamental flaw as those bamboo headphones. It looked like science without being science. Consider one of his examples. For years, researchers studied whether rats could learn to navigate mazes faster with each subsequent attempt. Hundreds of experiments were conducted, papers were published, debates raged in psychology journals. Different research groups claimed different results. Some found dramatic learning effects, others found none. The field churned out study after study, each following proper experimental protocols, each with control groups and statistical analysis. Everything appeared rigorous, but Feynman noticed something. When a researcher finally conducted an experiment accounting for whether the rats could actually hear or smell their way through the maze, not just see the visual cues everyone had been measuring, the learning effects vanished. For decades, researchers had been inadvertently allowing rats to use sensory information no one was controlling for. Every previous experiment, despite following the form of good science, had missed this fundamental variable. The papers weren't fraudulent. The researchers weren't stupid. They had the appearance of scientific rigor, but they lacked what Feynman called scientific integrity. This reveals something crucial about the difference between methodology and integrity. You can follow every rule, cite every source, use every statistical tool correctly, and still produce garbage if you're not honestly trying to disprove yourself. The cargo cult scientist runs the experiment. The real scientist tries to think of every reason the experiment might be fooling them. Feynman gave another example that hit closer to home for physicists. Robert Millikan's famous oil drop experiment measured the charge of an electron, fundamental work that won him the Nobel Prize in 1923. Millikan reported his value with high confidence. His published data showed beautiful consistency. But here's what Feynman discovered when he dug into the history. Millikan's first published value was slightly off. As subsequent physicists tried to replicate his work, they kept getting values slightly different from Millikan's. Each researcher would get a number, compare it to Millikan's prestigious result, assume their own methodology must be flawed, adjust their procedure, and eventually publish a value closer to Millikan's. The next researcher would do the same. For years, the scientific community slowly crept toward the correct value through this chain of partial self-deception. Each physicist thought they were being rigorous. Each followed proper experimental protocols. Each had good reasons to trust Millikan's earlier work. But collectively, they were practicing cargo cult science. They had the form of verification without the substance of genuine independent testing. They were unconsciously tuning their results to match expectations rather than measuring reality cleanly. Feynman emphasized this wasn't about dishonesty. Most cargo cult scientists are sincere. They believe they're doing real science. The problem runs deeper than fraud. It's about a type of self-deception so subtle you don't notice you're doing it. He described it this way. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That sentence from the 1974 address cuts to the heart of cargo cult thinking. Your own brain actively works against you seeing your mistakes. You notice evidence that confirms what you believe. You unconsciously discount evidence that contradicts it. You run the experiment until you get the result that seems reasonable, then stop. You interpret ambiguous data in the direction you expect, and every step feels like you're being objective. This wasn't just about scientific research, but about any field where intellectual honesty matters. Cargo cult thinking appears everywhere, in business, in education, in journalism, in policy making, in your own work. Whenever you're going through the motions of rigor without the substance of genuine truth-seeking, you're building a bamboo control tower. Back to that commencement address. Feynman told those graduates about scientific integrity, which he defined as bending over backwards to show how you might be wrong, not just following the rules, not just being thorough, but actively searching for the ways your own conclusion could be mistaken. He said scientists should give all the information that could call their results into question, not hide contrary evidence in footnotes, not emphasize data that supports their hypothesis while downplaying contradictions. Put the ammunition for your critics right in the abstract. He gave a specific instruction. If you're doing an experiment, you should report everything that you think might make it invalid, not only what you think is right about it. Most researchers do the opposite. They report what supports their conclusion and briefly acknowledge limitations only if forced to. They have reasons. They need publications to get tenure. They need funding. They want their ideas to be taken seriously. Every incentive pushes them toward emphasizing confirmatory evidence and minimizing doubt. The system rewards cargo cult science because cargo cult science produces cleaner narratives, more confident conclusions, and easier to publish papers. Real science is messy. It's full of uncertainties and contradictory data and results that don't make sense. Papers that honestly report all that messiness often look weaker than papers that smooth over the complications. So researchers learn to build bamboo control towers, studies that look rigorous but are actually exercises in selective presentation. But then Feynman went further. He told those graduates that they had a responsibility beyond their own research. They needed to refuse to participate in cargo cult science even when everyone around them accepted it, even when it cost them professionally. He said, "You will not only do no particular good, but if you have any reasons for a feeling of pride on the basis of your accomplishment, you will lose it." That's a devastating message for a commencement speech. You spent 4 years earning this degree, and now you're being told that simply following the norms of your field will make your work worthless and drain your accomplishment of meaning. But Feynman wasn't trying to discourage them. He was warning them about the specific trap that catches people who think they're too educated to fall for obvious nonsense. The cargo cult islanders can be forgiven. They had no framework for understanding radio communication or aerodynamics. They were doing their honest best with limited information. But a physicist who cherry-picks data, a researcher who stops investigating once they get the result they wanted, they know better. They have the tools to recognize their own self-deception. They just choose to ignore those tools because building a real control tower is harder than building one from bamboo. Consider how this applies today when you're evaluating expertise. Someone has a degree from a prestigious institution. They've published papers in respected journals. They use sophisticated technical language. They present data in compelling visualizations. They cite sources. Every marker of legitimate expertise is present. But are they practicing cargo cult expertise? Are they selectively presenting evidence that supports their preferred narrative while burying contradictions? Are they mistaking the appearance of rigor for actual rigor? The same principle applies today when you're doing your own knowledge work. You research a topic. You find sources that support your existing belief. You organize them into a coherent argument. You anticipate objections and prepare responses. You present your conclusion with confidence. You've done everything that looks like thorough analysis. But did you genuinely try to prove yourself wrong? Did you seek out the strongest counterarguments, or just the ones you could easily refute? Did you update your belief when you encountered contradictory evidence, or did you explain away that evidence to preserve your original conclusion? Most people go through life building bamboo control towers without realizing it. They follow career advice that sounds sophisticated, but they never verify whether it actually produces results. They adopt productivity systems that feel rigorous, but never track whether their actual output improves. They learn frameworks and models and methodologies that give them the appearance of expertise without the substance of genuine understanding. They're not being dishonest. They genuinely believe they're being thorough, but they're fooling themselves. Feynman had seen this pattern throughout his career. During the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, he watched brilliant scientists get so invested in their theoretical models that they ignored experimental data, contradicting their predictions. After the war, he saw academics build entire research programs around fashionable ideas that crumbled when subjected to genuine scrutiny. He noticed how institutions incentivized the appearance of productivity over actual discovery, how funding favored projects that promised clear outcomes over genuine exploration, how peer review rewarded papers that fit expected patterns over papers that challenge assumptions. And he recognized the trap catches everyone eventually, including him. He told a story about his own early research where he'd gotten excited about a result, only to realize later he'd been unconsciously interpreting ambiguous data in the direction he wanted. He hadn't committed fraud, he'd just been human. The experience taught him that intellectual integrity requires constant vigilance against your own motivated reasoning. This brings us to the deepest layer of what Feynman was warning about. Cargo cult science isn't just methodologically flawed research. It's the betrayal of science's fundamental purpose. Science exists to be wrong less often, not to be perfectly right, not to achieve absolute certainty, but to gradually, painfully, honestly reduce the ways we fool ourselves about reality. Every scientific practice, peer review, replication, controlled experiments, statistical analysis, exists as a defense against human self-deception. When you go through the motions of those practices without their spirit, you've kept the shell and killed the organism. You're waving palm fronds on a bamboo runway, wondering why truth won't land. Feynman ended his commencement address with something unexpected. He didn't give those graduates a rousing call to action or an inspirational message about changing the world. He told them they'd probably face a choice at some point in their careers. They could practice cargo cult science, publish regularly, get funding, build a respectable career, gain the respect of peers who are doing the same thing. Or they could practice real science, which might mean publishing less, struggling for funding, being seen as difficult or uncooperative, and possibly never achieving conventional success. He couldn't tell them which to choose. He could only explain what each path meant. 36 years before that speech, in 1938, those Pacific Islanders were still building their bamboo airports. They believed with complete sincerity that they were doing everything necessary to bring back the cargo. They'd be heartbroken to learn they were wasting their effort. But at least they didn't know better. They lacked the framework to understand their mistake. You don't have that excuse. You know the difference between going through the motions and genuinely trying to be less wrong. You know when you're selecting evidence to support your conclusion versus following evidence wherever it leads. You know when you're adopting the appearance of expertise versus building actual competence. You feel the difference, even if you don't admit it. The question Feynman left hanging in that speech hall was simple. Which runway are you building? The one where planes might actually land, even if it takes longer and looks less impressive. Or the bamboo version that photographs well but serves no real purpose except maintaining your illusions. Because here's what he understood that most people miss. The cargo cult version feels like it's working. You're busy. You're productive. You're following best practices. You're accumulating credentials and publications and recognition. The activity itself creates the illusion of progress. The planes never come, but you're so focused on waving the palm fronds that you don't notice. Real science, real expertise, real understanding, it often looks less impressive from the outside. It's slower. It's full of dead ends and mistakes and uncertainty. It requires saying, "I don't know," more often than feels comfortable. It means abandoning ideas you invested years in when the evidence contradicts them. It offers fewer guarantees and more humility. But it's the only kind that works when reality comes to evaluate your conclusions. The only kind that builds something lasting instead of decorative. The only kind that brings actual planes to actual runways instead of maintaining comfortable delusions about bamboo. Feynman gave them one last piece of advice before they walked across that stage to receive their diplomas. I'm talking about a specific extra type of integrity that is not lying, but bending over backwards to show how you're maybe wrong that you ought to have when acting as a scientist. That extra type of integrity. That's the piece missing